Right. You've read the title. International Men's Day. A lot of this focuses on mental health, and the actual day was yesterday at the time of recording. Today's November 20th. The actual day is November 19th. And this is a topic that, is important to me as a man, but also someone who really can see a lot of the negative things that men face that really just don't get talked about. There's a lot of conversation that happens around women and women's rights, and it can be hard at times to talk about some of the struggles that men go through. And I will be very upfront that I'm in the camp of everyone has their problems and everything needs to be addressed. There are definitely times where certain people's problems need to be focused on more. There's something more pressing, or maybe something overall is more problematic for this person or this group. These things should never be explored or taken care of in complete ignorance or ignoring of other people's problems, though. So the topic is really important. This video is not going to be very long. It's more just to add another voice, add another video to this concept. And it is something, like I say in a lot of my videos, that is better suited for a more in-depth video. But there are a lot of things that we know when it comes to supporting men that typically emotions can be harder to talk about for men. Typically, men are, I believe, more likely to be victim of violent crime. The domestic violence rates against men are much higher than people think. The suicide rates are much higher. Victims of violent crime, much higher. Depression looks different in men than women. A lot of the work that we do in mental health is feminine in a lot of ways in its treatment, because a lot of the practitioners are oftentimes a little bit more feminine. You have to be a little bit more caring and feminine, not in the sense of male or female, but in terms of personality or how we're coming across. In that way, a lot of people who are leaning a little bit more feminine will move into mental health because it's caring, and it's attuning, and it is sensitive, and it is emotional in a way that is often found with other feminine traits. So most people wouldn't call the field that I'm in a very masculine field, right? So we often treat from the lens that many people in the field are experiencing. So there are a lot of things about men's masculinity that gets missed in mental health. And so I think there's a lot of room for conversation, and I think it's really good to talk about men's mental health, and not like necessarily men's rights in that sense, but just how to approach and help continue to develop men and get them to healthier and safer places overall in life. And I think it is extremely important to talk about because, yes, there's going to be people who don't agree with this, but society works better when our men are healthy. Society works better when our women are healthy. And so anything we can do to make certain people better, phenomenal. So this is something that I do think should be talked about more. Yes, the timing of this video is a day behind, but I'd rather talk about it somewhat than not at all. So, men have their own things that they're going through. And there's plenty of studies on that. I think Brene Brown has started studying that in the past and has done some good work on it. There have been sociological studies on the misconception that a lot of women have for men's lives. Typically, women very much misunderstand how men live day to day. And yes, you can flip that and say men don't typically understand the day to day of women. I think the issue there is that is talked about a lot, but we don't really talk about how men are misunderstood. And that's actually really, really important. Both of those pieces matter. And so that conversation is relevant and important and does need to be talked about more. And I think it is, and something that I try to do with people as well. And like with any of these things, it's all subjective. So any issue that a certain group of people face is pretty rarely 100% true for that entire group of people. There's an individual aspect to everyone, to individuals. And there's also things that typically are more likely or true for certain people. So the fact that men are more likely to follow through on suicide and die by suicide does not mean that every man's going to end their life with suicide. And it also doesn't mean that every man's going to struggle with suicide or even ever think about it. Some never will. That's just how that is. It's just a understanding that statistics show us certain likelihoods or increased chances. So that's really important to know too whenever you're listening to this or other videos where we talk about more likely or less likely, or that it doesn't speak to everyone. And if you hear that and you're like, well, not me, it's like, yeah, probably not you. Or if you get upset at those at all, these are just data points that we have. And sometimes those data points are wrong or the studies were done inappropriately. And when we see that, we should call it out and get rid of those studies. But when they are supported study after study after study, it's good to press into that. And some people might see, well, like for instance, men are more likely to be victims of violent crime than women are. And one easy response to that would be like, okay, well, who's perpetrating the violence against them? Typically other men. So you might say, okay, so the issue there is men. And what I would stop is that doesn't necessarily help the conversation to just say, well, it brings it back to men are the problem. The issue is violence is an issue with the male population. There are men who are typically going to be committing more violent crimes than women, and men are on the receiving end. So the piece there is, how can we reduce the amount of people that are victims of violent crime? How can we reduce the amount of people who are perpetrators of violent crime? And the data is helpful. Okay, men seem to be the top of both of those. Great. So it seems like a lot of this conversation needs to happen in the direction of men. Yes, we can teach women how to protect themselves more, and we can also teach women how to be less violent, but they're not really the key factor there. And so whenever you call out like a yes but for this stuff, like I think another really common statistic is the sexual assault rates perpetrated against men. And again, these are often done by other men. There's a lot of sexual abuse that happens from women to men, and that's actually a really, really big issue, especially with how it's talked about, and the chances of men being believed are really awful, and they're often even laughed at about it. So looking at like, okay, this is what we know about those statistics. What do we have about the implications? What's behind them? What do they mean? And taking things a step further, that's why you need to be careful when you look at articles that say, well, this statistic proved this, or this data proves this. It's not proving, it's just giving us information. It's giving us data to support one idea or another. And it doesn't always paint the whole picture. It just says, this is what this says. Cool. This is why we look at what people did for the study, how they did the study, what was going into this process, and what information is still missing and needed. So there are a lot of things that we know about men's lives that are difficult and challenging, and some of that is caused by other men, but it still maintains that men need that attention to help. Does that make sense? So we need to address men about men's issues. We can't just say, well, if the men are causing these issues, then that's their own problem. Who's going to help? Anyone who is able to help. And obviously that doesn't happen at the expense of your own health and well-being. But you think of someone like me as a man, and as someone who, is, well, I'm not a violent person, and I've not been on the receiving end of bad violence from other men. I've had moments, but don't have any violent trauma. So that puts me in a position where I can probably interact in a way that's not going to be triggering or traumatizing to me to help with that. And men who have been perpetrators or victims who have come through that are in a really, really great place to speak to other men. So the real part of this that I think is the most helpful is getting men to a point where we can talk about stuff and not have this complete one end where it's hyper feminizing men. We don't want to turn men into women, and we don't want to turn men into something that they are not. There's a way that men talk about emotions and sensitive topics that will look different than a lot of women. And so that's important too. It's not like there's a spectrum and women are over here. There's often a way that women talk about things that men don't. And again, this is generalized for the most part, but being able to tap into the way that men talk about sensitive and light topics and do that with strength through their strengths, and also to avoid this doubling down on hypermasculinity that a lot of people will talk about, like toxic masculinity. We need men to be masculine, but we don't need men to be abusive inappropriately aggressive, overly controlling, and possessive and violent. That is, I would agree with those things being in the toxic masculinity. I would disagree with a lot of things that are put in toxic masculinity, and I would say that they're not, but that extreme is. So we want to avoid those two extremes of keeping men men and not trying to get them to behave like women in terms of how we talk about emotions and sensitive topics, or to behave in a more feminine way, so to speak, but also not get them to this hyper masculine, overly tough place. And there's space in between. And that's why I think it's important for men to talk with other men about this, because men understand men in a way that women don't. Women understand women in a way that men don't. And both have a place across that aisle. So there are definitely topics and interactions that it makes more sense as a man for me to talk with other men about. And then there are situations where, as a man, it makes sense for me to talk to women about. A lot of my therapy practice is working with women. And that looks different than if a woman was working with them. Because sometimes people need healing from the opposite gender, sometimes they need it within. And it's how we all come together to work through these things. So it's important that women support men as we move through our struggles. And it's important that men support each other. It's also important that men support women as they move through their struggles, and women support women. So I probably added a lot of caveats and nuance that hopefully is not needed, but I know people get really opinionated when we start talking about generalizations between genders, but they do exist. And no, it's not everyone. I'll say that for the 100,000th time. So, yeah, that's what I got. So, recognizing International Men's Day and being a man, there's definitely a lot of stuff that we're still working through and often needing help on. And I'm a big proponent of trying to bring down all of those negative statistics as much as we can. So, yeah, if you're a man listening, thanks for tuning in, and hopefully this offers some support with anything on your mind. And if you're a woman listening, hopefully this can offer some insight and into some of what not just the data says, but even, I guess, some of the anecdotes that I'm trying to offer to. So, yeah, happy Wednesday, everyone, and I'll talk to you later.